We will now establish whether or not we have a quorum, and I'd ask one of the checkers to advise us the number of members. Unfortunately, we do not have any young people carrying around microphones. So we've got a new system so that everybody will know who you are. You've got to approach the rostrum here and speak at the middle of the floor. Mrs. Searles. Okay.
There's a switch. Pull it towards you. Straight towards you. It says on.
Okay, Mr. Moderator, we have 88 at the present time.
Okay. We presently have 88 members present. 73 members are necessary for a quorum, so we do have a quorum. The audio coverage today is provided by First Choice Communication, and while we're talking about that communication, the new system will be, and there should be on each side of the microphone, a chair. And I'm not sure that those chairs have gotten placed. There are. The new system will be, in order to try to expedite the meeting, that I'll recognize a person. If there are other hands up at the same time, I will then at the same time recognize those other people, and up to 3 people will be standing, 1 standing, 2 sitting, so that we can keep the meeting moving along. And as you get up and are replaced, the other people will come up, because there'll be no microphones passed among the people here so assembled. Now, the meeting is being interpreted today for the deaf and hard of hearing by Corey Brunner and Elizabeth Bergerk. The meeting will be televised, but not today, but will be broadcast next week by the Brattleboro Community Television, channels 8 and 10, at a time to be determined, and that will be noticed on their daily calendar. Our procedural rules are basically the same as in our annual town meeting. With respect to voting, voting on all matters shall be by standing, by division of the town meeting members, or by roll call vote of the town meeting members. A division of the town meeting members shall be held in the discretion of the moderator or upon demand of 3 or more members. A roll call vote shall be held upon the demand of 6 or more town meeting members. With respect to debate, no town meeting member or voter of the town shall speak more than twice on the same subject without leave of the town meeting members. Town meeting members or voters of the town who have once spoken shall not again be entitled to the floor to the exclusion of another who has not spoken. The chair is recommending that, in fairness to all, we do not want to limit the debate, but we would ask everyone to try to keep their remarks to at least 2 minutes or less. I don't have a timekeeper, so you don't have to be concerned about getting cut off. I'm going to leave that to each of your good judgments to make sure that that rule can be somewhat complied with. This meeting today is in effect very historic. We haven't had an open meeting such as this to talk about the charter since 1996. The commission, as all of you probably know, was set up by the Select Board in November of 2007. The Commission has worked diligently for the past 3 years, presenting proposals of amendment, seeking advice from past and present office holders throughout the state of Vermont, and holding several public meetings here in town to solicit comments, ideas, and opinions. The charter document, having been completed, is before you today. And I want to make sure everybody understands what that process is and why we are here. The legislative body, the selectmen, are the ones who warned this meeting. So therefore, we are proceeding with the usual seating arrangements of having the selectmen at the front of the room for better communications. And to keep the communications open, we have invited all of the members of the Charter Review Committee to be present up front, so there will be a better communication between you, the members, and the members of the Charter Commission. Now, we do have 2 other members of the Charter Commission who are not town meeting members, and they will be permitted, once the motion is made, to come forward and join their colleagues at the Charter Commission table. Now, we are going to proceed with each item or each article separately. The articles can be voted up or down or can be amended. So we will hopefully, as we speak to the articles, we will confine our remarks to what is germane, or basically what involves the article. So we don't want to open up any other article until we've completed the article that's before the body. A couple of other brief announcements, which I think are important. Restrooms. Restrooms are located, if you go out the door, you take a left. Go down as far as you can, and you'll see a right turn. Take the right, and on the right, on your right, there are 2 restrooms, male and female. If you forget, just ask one of your colleagues, and I'm sure somebody will remember. Now, another article, until 11:30, the BUHS Swiss Exchange Club is selling baked goods, quiche, coffee, tea, and they now have milk and cream. No certain price, it's just on donation. And this is their 32nd year of going to Switzerland from Brattleboro Union High School. That in and of itself is another record, as far as I'm concerned. And they are going to a place in Switzerland that is predominantly French. So as they would say when they greet you after you make a donation, merci. The chair recognizes Mr. DeGray for a resolution.
Mr. Moderator, I move that Town Attorney Robert Fisher be authorized to sit in the reserve section with the Select Board, and Charter Review Commission members Larry Block and Richard Dudman be authorized to sit with the Commission.
Is there a second? Second. Motion is made and seconded that Attorney Robert Fisher be authorized to sit in the reserve section with Select Board members and the Charter Review Commission members Larry Block and Richard Dunman be allowed to sit with the Commission. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by standing. Those opposed? The ayes have it, and those parties may come forth. Preliminary motion number 2. Chair recognizes Dora Babulis.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the electronic media be permitted to remain in the reserved section.
Is there a second? Ms. Babulis moves that the electronic media be permitted to remain in the reserved section. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by standing. Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the electronic media may remain seated in the reserved section. Article 1. Chair recognizes Mr. DeGray.
Mr. Moderator, I move that the town clarify the purpose of the charter by adding language to the preamble.
Is there a second? Mr. DeGray moves that the town clarify the purpose of the charter by adding language to the preamble. Chair recognizes Mr. Block.
To address it, put the switch on, right on the...
To address this question, I would like to turn it over to Commissioner Richard Dudman.
Mr. Block yields to Mr. Dunban.
The change to the preamble is simply to take the last paragraph and make clear what it means for the charter to represent the framework of service to the citizens. And so it spells out by listing the items that define what it means to be of service to the community. And this is particularly apropos in terms of what has happened in the last several weeks, in that it sets a framework for saying what our relationship to one another is, and the charter is set as a framework for allowing that to happen.
The question is, shall you amend the preamble as recommended by the Charter Committee? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Well, I've got to remember that we've got to stand. And all those in favor, please stand until counted. You may be seated. Those opposed? The ayes do have it, and you've adopted the amendment to the charter. Article 2. Shall the town add the term and definition of general town meeting to the charter? Chair recognizes Ms. Babulis.
Thank you. I move... Sorry. I move that the town add the term and definition of general town meeting to the charter.
Is there a second? Second. Ms. Babulis moves that the town add the term and definition of general town meeting to the charter. Chair recognizes Mr. Block.
The term general town meeting differentiates between representative town meeting, and when you read through our existing charter, as the commission did it, we found that the term town meeting was sometimes referring to representative town meeting and sometimes referring to the annual town meeting where we get together and elect our officers and so forth. And so in order to clarify, the Commission's recommended the term general town meeting to refer to the gathering of the voters of the town for elections and referenda and the like. And I guess I can't speak to the next question until the next question. So,
Question is, shall you amend the charter as recommended by Mr. Block? Mr. Dimes.
Hello. I move that the amendment be slightly amended to read, in addition to the elected members, the following shall be members ex officio. The select board members, the school directors, treasurer, clerk, etc. Because for clarity, the different members are included individually, and I think it should be clear that the select board members are individuals and not empaneled or presiding at the meeting, but like the rest of the members ex officio, that they are admitted as individuals, and this should be reflected in the language.
Mr. Dimes moves that the amendment which he proposes clarify those who are members of the general town meeting. Maybe I could ask Mr. Block to make some comments on that.
I think that maybe you're confused, Kurt. We're defining general town meeting as written when the meeting of the voters of the town of Brattleboro and or the town school district act on matters of election of all officers, referenda, and matters to be acted upon by Australian ballot. That is the definition suggested for general town meeting.
I apologize. I'm addressing the question number 3. Apologize. I'll speak again at the next.
Unless there's objection, we will treat the matter of the amendment proposed by Mr. Dimes as not having been made since it was withdrawn.
Thank you.
So the question now is, shall you adopt Article 2 as recommended by the Charter Committee? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Standing. Those opposed, please stand. The ayes have it, and Article 2 has been adopted. Article 3. Shall the town add the term, Article 3, the chair recognizes Mr. Pillsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town add the term and definition of representative town meeting to the charter.
Is there a second? Second. Motion's been made and seconded that the town add the term and definition of representative town meeting to the charter. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Bach?
Yes, again, this is to further clarify, when reading through the charter, what the previous term town meeting is now mostly replaced by representative town meeting, which is the actual reference in our existing charter. You will not see the term town meeting appear in the charter regularly anymore, but representative town meeting when it means just that.
Are you ready for the question? Mr. Dimes?
Again, for clarity, as the other members who are admitted to the representative town meeting ex officio, as they are admitted individually, I think the select board members should be admitted individually and referred to as the select board members, just for clarity.
Mr. Dimes moves that the article be amended as he so stated, Is there any further discussion? Mr. Gannett.
Mr. Moderator, Bob Gannett from District 1. I feel this article should be defeated for a number of reasons. The main one is that the source of power comes from different places, one from the state, one from the town. And I think it would be a great mistake for the town putting it in its charter. In effect, it gives the town the right to amend with the further provision in the proposal that in case there's a conflict, the charter prevails. That means, if you look at it technically, the charter can amend a state statute, and that is not sound. And we have to remember as we go through here that the legislature is going to have a say on approving what we send up, and I don't think they'll be very happy to think that we are putting the town charter in a place to amend or repeal something that has been a state statute. Furthermore, as I read, I think the definition of the the local group is confusing. Apparently, the only meeting, the implication, if you look carefully, is that the vote for the town is only at the town meeting. It talks of town meeting, and it's as if the only time that the town meeting members did anything was at the annual meeting. That's not true. We have, since it's been adopted, every meeting other than the one that has to be by ballot has been by the town meeting members. So I think there's a fallacy in the language. I think there's a very strong fallacy in shifting the authority for the town meeting members to the charter when it originated by statute in Montpelier and should only be subject to that. So it would be my hope, Mr. Moderator, that we vote this down.
Question technically now is on the amendment proposed by Mr. Dimes, which is to specify who some of the members are that attend town meeting. Mr. Block.
First of all, in the charter, in section 2, in section 4, of Article 2, the makeup of the representative town meeting members is described in paragraph B, which includes reference to the select board, our state senators and state representatives, and I believe that covers that request for amendment by Mr. Dimes. And with all due respect to Mr. Gannett, I believe that the Article 3 in question simply refers to representative town meeting when it is time for the representative town meeting to gather or to act or to have authority over any particular provision in the charter. It does nothing more than that. It simply replaces the term town meeting, where it is referring to the representative body, and adds the word representative to it. It doesn't do anything more than that.
The question now is on Article 3 and its amendment. Mr. Coram.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. How does the question I have is with respect to Mr. Dimes' amendment, or proposed amendment, Addendum A to our charter in Section 3F indicates that the Select Board, as well as others, school directors, town clerk, town treasurer, moderator, and town representatives who are residents of Brattleboro, are members ex officio of town meeting. So why do we need to have this amendment if we've got that in Addendum A, Section 3F of our charter?
Questions on the Dimes amendment? Mr. Fisher?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In reference to Mr. Coram's question, I'm not going to answer the policy reason behind that, but in Article 2, Section, going to be the new Section 4, there's a section in here that talks about, in the event of a discrepancy between a section of the main charter and the Addendum A, the provisions set forth in the charter shall prevail. So what the Charter Commission, and it can speak to this, did not go through and make full amendments to Addendum A, which is a separate act of the legislature. It put in this provision saying, in the event of a conflict, the provisions of the main charter, which in and of itself, if passed by the legislature, is an act of the legislature, but that would prevail. And I bring that up partly in respect to Mr. Dimes's motion to amend, but also with regard to the adding the term representative town meeting. We do have a section in Article 2, Section 4E, that talks about the issuance of the bonds, which is another section, but bonds are required to be by Australian ballot, but in our charter, both the existing charter and the proposed charter, those are to be voted upon in the first instance by representative town meeting members. So as far as clarification, we may want to add in to act on all articles, including municipal bonding articles. So I raise that. That may be partly to Mr. Dimes's motion to amend, but it may be the subject of another motion to amend. Thank you.
Question is on the Dimes amendment. Are you ready for that question? Ms. Boubulis.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I think actually I wasn't sure why Kurt, to begin with, was saying what he was saying, but now that I'm looking at the language says the select board, and then it says the school director. So the school directors are looked at as individuals, but the select board is looked at as a whole body. And actually, he has a point, because it's actually the members of the select board and not the select board. I'm not sure if he's, I'm not sure if all of the language that he's talking about makes sense, but that just from a grammatical standpoint.
Questions on the Dimes amendment? Mr. Block.
There is no mention of select board in Article 2, Section 1, definitions of representative town meeting. You are guided to that single paragraph, which is the only paragraph relevant to this article. Representative town meeting shall mean the meeting of town meeting members elected pursuant to Article 2, Section 2 of this charter, to act on all articles, except those which relate to the election of officers, referenda, and other matters to be voted upon by Australian ballot, and any other articles or subjects reserved to a general town meeting. That is the only paragraph that is being considered by this particular article question.
Mr. Corum.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. So, am I to understand then the proposed amendment by Mr. Dimes would be superfluous at this point because of section, proposed section 2, Article 2 rather, section 2, and so select board members would be members of town meeting, as would Union High School directors as well, correct? The listers would be as well? I'm not being facetious because it's under Article 2, Section 2E is a board of listers. And I would assume they would also be town meeting representatives as well? And anybody else under A, B, through H of Section 2, Article 2, correct?
A member of the Charter Commission's interrogated Mr. Brock.
Actually, Section 4 describes the makeup of the representative town meeting body, and an amendment is needed in order to correct where it says Section 2 in that paragraph to Section 4. It is Section 4 that defines the makeup of the representative town meeting, as it describes what it consists of in detail on page 2 of the revised charter, Section 4B. The representative town meeting consists of up to 140 elected voters, and it goes on to describe who the members are of that body. So there is a need for an amendment here. There is an error in listing Section 2 in this paragraph.
Question is on the Dimes amendment. Mr. Phillips.
I know, Mr. Moderator, amendments to amendments are not favored, but I do have a clarification. If Mr. Dimes would be willing to consider withdrawing his amendment, that may satisfy him. May I?
You may
state
proceed.
that? So it would read representative town meeting as defined under Article Roman numeral 2, Section 4, comma, and then proceed as printed. I think the reference to Article Roman numeral 2, Section 2 is still appropriate because I think it refers to the election, the manner of election. So I think that might capture Mr. Dimes's concern. So he's nodding.
Mr. Dimes, do you have any objection to that amendment?
I agree to the amendment, to the amendment, to the amendment.
Now, Mr. Phillips, do you have that written down?
I can certainly do that very quickly.
Okay. And if you could bring a copy up to the town clerk, we want to make sure we have it officially. The amendment to Section 1 under Article 2, and looking at the definition representative town meeting, will read as shall mean the meeting of town meeting members as defined, this is the new language, as defined in section, and it's Roman numeral 2, defined in Article Roman numeral 2, Section 4, elected pursuant to Article 2, Section 2. That's the Dimes-Phillips amendment. Any further discussion? All those in so amending the article kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing. The amendment is carried and adopted. The recurring question now is, shall Article 3, as amended, be adopted? Are you ready for that question? Mr. Elwell.
With any group, there's always a dissenter, and I'm afraid I'm the dissenter on this group. I warned the commission when we talked about making changes, to the Act of 1959, which is the act that sets up the framework and legal organization of the representative town meeting. And this is one of the things that, in my opinion, interferes and overrides that original article, and for the future could confuse and lead to a lot of legal litigation that would be unnecessary if we don't mix the apples and the oranges. So I would recommend that this article be defeated, because I think that if it's approved, that we're going to run into some legal problems down the road, because people are going to say, well, what you've done is you've changed the original legislation that the state legislature passed, and you can't do that because you don't have any authority to do that.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 3 as amended? Are you ready for that question?
Mr. Moderator.
Mr. Barber.
I'd like to seize on Mr. Fisher's point about the issuance of municipal bonds and to amend the definition of representative town meeting to read as it is printed at the moment in the fourth line, which begins, this charter to act on all articles, including those on the issuance of municipal bonds, comma.
Now, Mr. Barber, are we talking about Article 3, which is the definition of representative town meeting?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I've just been advised that that would probably fall under a technical change and doesn't have to be in here, so I'll withdraw it.
Mr. Barber withdraws his proposal of amendment. Yes, Ms. Johnson?
Am I on? Yeah? Okay. I just would like to question my fellow commission member about his objection that he just raised in terms of changing the definition, the terminology from representative town meeting from town meeting to representative town meeting in one place, I don't understand why that's changing the 1959 material, and on the other hand, Article 2 is not. When you change the term, all we're doing here, the idea is to differentiate which town meeting is being referred to. So in the previous article, which we've already passed, we're going to call the time when we come together to vote. We don't come together, we all come individually, and we vote on who's going to be our select board members and so forth. And that's general town meeting. And, it's town meeting day in the state and so forth. And then representative town meeting is to distinguish so that it's a meeting of the body of elected representatives, and this is one of them. So it doesn't just have to be the main one there. And so I don't see why, A, we're changing anything that's going to disturb the 1959 legislation, and B, why the objection, I don't understand it. If you would explain it, maybe I would see it. But why it wouldn't also then apply to Article 2, which we have already passed.
Ms. Johnson, I assume that you wish to interrogate Mr. Elwell.
Yes, I do.
Mr. Elwell is interrogated, if he desires to be.
The most innocent changes to a legal document, and that's what this is, can really lead to some difficult paths down the road in the future. And my concern is that when you start pulling things out of one piece of legislation, which is passed in this case by the state legislature, and adding it into another piece of legislation, which is our town charter, that there could be some difficulties between the town and the state legislature in the future. And as Mr. Gannett indicated, when this document reaches Montpelier, there may be some serious questions about some of the things that we've proposed in here. And we'll be talking about some of those later. I'm just concerned that a very innocent change, as this seems to be, could be present some very difficult situations for the future.
But I don't understand why it seems to be connected then to Article 2 as well, where we changed a term. I don't understand why that objection isn't applied.
It well could be, Ronnie, but that is not stated as part of the Act of 1959, whereas the representative town meeting is specific to that act.
Point of order. Mr. Phillips.
I have great respect for Senator Gannett and Mr. Elwell, but it appears to me that this discussion is not germane to this particular motion. There's no reference in this article to any state statute or legislature. I think there's some confusion as to what we're actually voting on. Just the definition of representative town meeting is what I understood was the subject. So that's my question, is whether this is a germane discussion.
Well, I think it's germane to the extent that does this vote on this particular change run contrary to state law? That's the sense that I have. And maybe I'm misinterpreting what Mr. Gannett and Mr. Elwell said, and I don't want to open up Pandora's box, but I think it's fair comment at this point. Yes, Mr. Copans.
I may misunderstand it. It's my understanding that what we're voting on today are, in essence, proposed changes that we will then send up to the state and ask them to ratify the new charter, so that we're not overthrowing anything. We are making, are agreeing on the request we want to make to them. Am I incorrect?
Mr. Copeland's, Mr. Elwell, I think I'm going to let him to respond.
If you look at, get the right section, Section 2, excuse me, Section 4, Section 4A.
In which article?
In Article 2.
Thanks.
In the event of a discrepancy between this section of the Charter and number 302 of the Acts of 1959, Addendum A, the provisions set forth in this Charter shall prevail. Now that is pretty clear, and it says that anything in this Charter is to override Act of 1959, and that's my concern.
Question still on Article 3 as amended. Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I can address...
Mr. Moderator?
Mr. Phillips.
There's a level of confusion here because you keep talking about the question is on Article 3. And
That's right.
That may be the source of the confusion. I think we're on question 3.
In the warning for representative town meeting, they're listed as articles, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Article 3 is, shall the town add the term and definition of representative town meeting. That's to be differentiated from the article in the Charter that currently we're talking about Article 2 issues in the Charter. So if you want to look at it as question 3, it deals with Article 2 in the Charter. It is confusing, I agree. In response to Mr. Elwell's question, though, in the existing Charter, in Article 2, Section 3, which under the proposed new Charter is Article 2, Section 4, there is already a section that says, this is in the existing Charter, the representative town meeting is a guiding body for the town and a source of ideas, proposals, comments. See Addendum A, number 302, Acts of 1959. In the event of a discrepancy between this section and number 302 of the Acts of 1959, the provisions set forth in this Charter shall prevail. That is already in the Charter, and the change that which would now be Article 2, Section 4, which says, in the event of a discrepancy between this section of the Charter and number 302 of the Acts of 1959, comma, Addendum A, that's really part of what would be Question 17 or Article 17 here today, which is part of the technical changes to Article 2. So I think we may be having a debate over what isn't actually a recommended change by the Charter Commission.
Question is on question 3, which involves, to make sure I don't further confuse people, Article 2, subsection that contains the definition of representative town meeting as amended. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. I'm going to ask the clerks if they would count, please. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor, 66. Those opposed, 30. And the article of amendment with amendment has been passed. Yes. Next question is question 4 or Article 4. And the chair recognizes
Mr. Corum.
Mr. Corum.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town add the term and definition of, quote, voter, end quote, to the charter.
Is there a second? Second. Mr. Corum moves that the town add the term and definition of voter to the charter, and that term is set forth in Section 1 of Article 2, Roman numeral 2, immediately after the definition for representative town meeting. Mr. Block?
The Commission wanted to recognize voters as an essential part of the organization of town government, and therefore brought the definition up from the addenda D in the back, which is a non-binding, non-legal definition, into the front, where it is more recognized and legally defined.
Question is, shall you adopt the question 4 as part of the charter? Barbara Sunday.
Thank you. Barb Sunday, District 1. My concern with that is that it's really the state of Vermont who determines who is able to vote, who is the voter. They set those requirements, and I really think that this should refer back to the state statutes as opposed to developing our own definition of a voter. I mean, just at the last elections, there was a proposal to change so that 17-year-olds could vote, and so I think that there will be some issues with this if it goes up to the state and they think that we're setting our own definition of who can vote.
Question is on Article 4, Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I understand Barbara's concern. However, the matter of the defining a voter as a person of a certain age is sidestepped by simply saying of legal age, and we left in the fleshing out of the requirements for voting to make it crystal clear to young people who have never voted before, who have just become of legal age, exactly who this applies to, so that older teenagers who are now of legal age can suddenly say, hey, I can vote. And actually, I could run for office. And this is part of what we're trying to encourage, is citizen participation. So I would urge you to pass this in all its perhaps overly detailed language, so that it is clear to the most inexperienced of our citizens where they fit into the picture.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 4 with respect to the definition of voter? Ms. Johnson.
I would just like to reiterate that by having said of legal age, whatever the state legislature decides is the legal age is the legal age. We are not setting it. We are not setting any specifications of what makes a legal voter in this article. We're just defining a general area that the legal voter fits into. If you're of legal age and a citizen and a resident of the state of Vermont, I don't think that in any way takes away from the state's authority.
Questions on Article 4? Are you ready for that question? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I can't. Mr. Franks.
May I interrogate the town attorney, please?
You may. He desires to be.
Let me ask a question that he can choose. In the absence of this article, does it change anything?
Essentially, no. In the absence of this article, the term voter would be as defined by our state statutes, which currently reads, and the state can always change this, a person who will attain the full age of 18 by the date of the general election, who is a citizen of the United States, having resided in this state for a period established by the General Assembly, and who is of a quiet and peaceable behavior. I didn't know that was actually in there. And will take the following oath or affirmation, and that's the voter's oath. So in the absence of this article, voter would be defined as by state statute.
So if I understand correctly, there is a state statute that defines voters. The premise of this article, as I understood the presentation right now, is to inspire younger voters who, of course, are spending time reading the charter. I strongly recommend that any language where we might be in conflict with state statute, if we don't need it, don't put it in. So I would oppose this article. Thank you.
Question is on the adoption of Article 4 and the term voter. Mr. Carlton.
I'd like to amend the article by simply adding the word legal voting age.
Mr. Carlton has moved that we amend the article by making a small amendment, legal voting age. Motion's been made and second. Any further discussion on the amendment? If so, all those in favor, kindly rise. Those opposed, kindly rise. The amendment has been adopted. The question is, shall you adopt Article 4 as amended? Mr. Dunman.
I would like to reinforce again, the only point for why this is there is to show the full structure and the importance of the voter as a central part of who we are as a community. And it's not attempting to change anything at all, other than recognizing that all of our power comes from the voter.
Question is on Article 4. Mr. Harvey.
I just want to say that if that is the reason, then I believe that this language belongs in the addendum where it is.
Question is on Article 4. Mr. Corum.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I adhere, I think, in this case to the KISS principle, and that is keep it simple, stupid. I think we have a state statute that Bob just read. We want to keep this charter uncluttered. It's like the Constitution. And I think we're cluttering it with this kind of language when we've already got it in the state statute. And as Mr. George, I believe it is, just pointed out in Addendum D, it's defined. Why are we putting it in two places? It's already there. I think we should vote it down. Thank you.
Question is, shall you vote Article 4 as amended? Are you ready for that question? Mr. Barber.
We've heard a lot of talk during our various meetings about the proposed changes and municipal offices and the lack of candidates. Everybody's very worried about people not stepping forward to run for office. Part of that problem, I believe, is the lack of transparency. And I would caution the body that the more we lean toward turning membership in it into a priesthood open to a few, the more we harm our community. The more members of our community who take part in what we do and whose place in what we do is recognized, the stronger we are. And I urge you to pass this for reasons of transparency and openness.
Question is on Article 4 as amended. Mr. Everett.
Mr. Moderator, Dark Everett, District 3, I move the question.
Mr. Everett moves the question. It's been seconded. Now this takes a 2/3 vote. All in favor of ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. And I'd ask the checkers to count, please.
You guys rock. You guys rock. Just say a voter is a person of the people as per entitled to vote as per
Those opposed to ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of ceasing debate, 71. Those opposed, 25. A 2/3 vote having been achieved, debate is ceased. And the recurring question is, shall you add the term and definition of voter to the charter as amended? All in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. I think I better have the counters, please. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of the article, 36. Those opposed, 62. And the article is defeated. At this time, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Everybody can stretch, and we will reconvene at 10 minutes to 10. We'll call the meeting to order, and we're going to move to Article 5, or Question 5. And Question 5 is to be presented by Ms. Boboulas.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town increase the size of the select board from 5 to 7 members. No? Oh.
No.
Sorry. I'm reading Martha's. I move that the date of town elections be moved from the first Tuesday in March to the first Tuesday in November with related technical changes.
Is there a second? A motion has been made and seconded that we move the town elections from the first Tuesday in March to the first Tuesday in November with related technical changes. Mr. Block.
Thank you. The Commission recommends moving Election Day to the first Tuesday in November for the following reasons. We believe that there will be an increase in voter turnout at least every other year when there is a national election. We believe we'll reduce the cost of holding elections, again, at least every other year when there is a national election. This change would allow the select board that creates the budget to defend it at the annual representative town meeting. And also, in the nicer weather, I think there'll be more opportunity for candidates to meet the people more easily. And those are our 4 main reasons why we recommend this change.
Question is on Article 5 that the elections be moved from the first Tuesday in March to the first Tuesday in November. Are you ready for that question? Mrs. Coram.
Lynn Coram, District 3. This would, unfortunately, let the Union High School Board elections hang out there with nothing else around them, which would seriously decrease the number of people who would bother to vote in those elections. That budget is twice what your budget is. Also, that school, Vermonters are used to town meeting day as being a day when voting takes place. The schools are already closed. The cost factor would be eliminated, you just spoke about, because we'd have to have the Union High School, and that is a separate entity from this board. That is a day when people are used to voting, and the schools are already closed. I just think that the taking away that act of civic local voting and putting it into the national election would be detrimental to all of our local civic voting.
Question is on Article 5 to change the date of elections from the first Tuesday in March to the first Tuesday in November. Are you ready?
Mr. Moderator?
Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I was one of the first people, maybe the first 25 people maybe, to go before the Charter Commission over 3 years ago. And when I went there, this is one of the things that I was advocating for. Well, today as I sit before you, I have done a 180 on this. And the truth of the matter is some of the reasons that I gave for changing the election to November, only one still holds true today, and that would be really cost, which at that time, I think Annette was saying an election cost us $1,500. 3 years ago, we had a complete change on the board. We're voting 3 new board members in. This year, we're going to be doing the same thing. I can tell you as a sitting board member, I would rather be doing a budget with people who have been on the board at least 7 months than people coming in the middle of the process. We start our budget in October, the end of October. We're going through into November, And if you have new people visiting the board, and which we frequently do, you want them to be involved in the process and have a good understanding of what the budget. I think that's the most important thing that we do as select board members, is do that budget. And to do a budget with 3 people, potentially, and even if you vote to change the board to 7, you always have the potential to have 3 new board members. I'd rather have those 3 board members have some experience on the board in terms of when they start to do the budget. Also, voter turnout. Maybe every 4 years you get excited about the presidential election, as we did 2 years ago, and we have a high voter turnout. But the truth of the matter is, we're talking about our local election and getting voter turnout. Since I've spoken to the Charter Committee, we've had several different elections in different months of the year. We just had a vote on pay-as-you-throw in the warmest time of the year, a beautiful day that affects people's pocketbooks, and we only, and I want to emphasize, only got 24%. So for me, I think that the cost, that $1,500 cost, far outweighs having people, doesn't carry the weight of having people to do the budget. My solution, and the Charter is actually silent on this, and one of the things I said to the Charter Commission, and I've heard it from various people in the community, that when we go to town meeting, we have boards that put the budget together, aren't there to defend the budget. I've talked to the town attorney, and what my proposal would be, and it doesn't have to have this body's approval, is to have the elected officials on our March election take office on the first Monday after town meeting. So those people who put that budget together would go through town meeting, and we can do that without having, because the Charter is actually silent on it, if anybody can find it in the Charter, that would at least have the sitting boards of the town school, although I don't know what the statute says for them, but at least for us, defending a budget that they put together rather than what we've had in the past. We had it 3 years ago, we're going to have it again this year, of when they take office. And so you're sitting there at the desk and you're sitting there talking about a budget that you really didn't have anything to do with. But the bottom line is having a knowledge about the town and serving those 7 months from that March election to when you go into town meeting. We're getting monthly financial reports. You're getting a better understanding about what happens. So I strongly encourage you to vote this down, even though, 3 years ago I supported this. But when I really started to think about it, we're going to be better served by continuing to keep our election in March. If you're motivated, you come out to vote, and if you're not, you don't. There's nothing that we can do to motivate you as a personal voter, whether you're a town meeting member and/or a voter of the community. Thank you.
Question is on Article 5 to change the election date. Mr. Dudman.
If I understand what Mr. DeGray said, the budget starts the end of October. That means there's only a change of about a week, maybe 2 weeks, so that the body that would be doing the budget would have as much experience in terms of the building of the budget and in terms of what we're proposing as opposed to what he is saying.
Question is on Article 5, changing the election day. Mr. DeGray.
I think Mr. Dudman, I think the point that you're making is not 2 weeks experience on the board is a little bit different than having 7 months sitting on the board and having a better understanding of the town financials. I'd rather go to and do a budget with those people than do a budget with somebody who's been on the board for 2 or 3 weeks.
Question is on Article 5, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Don Webster, District 3. I agree wholeheartedly with the remarks of Select Board
Chair DeGray in terms of budget. Having a sense of going in and building a budget after you've just been elected after a couple of weeks just doesn't make sense, especially if you have more than one or two people, and that can happen at times this year. But the big reason I think I want to add to it is that the question is voter knowledge, attention, and ability to get information what they're voting on. Come November, every 2 years, especially every 4 years, you get inundated with ads from political parties, from interest groups. You can't think of a mailing without 4 or 5 pieces of literature. Reformer occasionally carries articles about those elections. Can you imagine the amount of coverage and information that would be out there for the voters in the middle of a presidential election on who you're going to elect for select board member? It strikes me that the focus of the town exclusively on the budget is so important, and to have members who are involved really be knowledgeable about it, to have the focus in March, it helps. If we have the election in November, I can't imagine the focus on local elections and the budgets be as significant as it is if we focus one time on the town, as this is our day, to deal with our business. So I would urge the defeat of this amendment.
Question is on Article 5, changing the date of the town elections. Mr. Agave.
For me, one of the main issues here is competency, in a sense. I didn't know it. What I have... This is all related. I would recommend that people kind of think of this as part of the package, most parts of which we will discuss a little bit later on, in terms of the size of the board and their terms, and all of which is part of the concept of trying to raise the quality and the competence and the experience of the people who serve on and the overall select board itself. We have all recognized throughout, and this is throughout the whole charter, what is required today to lead even a small municipality like ours is a great deal more complex skills and commitment and experience that has ever been required in the past, and it's going to require an even higher degree of competency and commitment in the future. And so I would like people to consider moving the elections to November in terms of the whole package of increasing the competence of the board, along with the other changes that will be spoken of later.
Question is on Article 5, Mr. Janis.
Yeah, Russ Janis, District 1. And Spoon, I appreciate the work and the sentiment of trying to get more involvement. I think that's important. My view is I'm in my 8th year now on the town school board, aligns more with Lynn Corum's views and with Chair DeGray's views, which is, I know when I came on in March, I found it incredibly daunting to just sign warrants for mere $250,000 worth of checks or something. I mean, that just sort of blew my mind. Like, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? And by having from March through the fall, you start recognizing what money is being spent on. At the end of the budget season for the schools, which ends in June, you start seeing where the budget is sort of reaching a limit, and you sort of understand what it means to have a budget and where it comes in. If I were to come in November, and even if it's towards the start of the budget cycle, I wouldn't really understand. And I think the reliance on administration, on principals and superintendent, and I imagine the same would be on the town side as well, might be either higher, or maybe you're emotional and going to be against it, but not as informed. And so I think that seasoning of the 7 months, I mean, it goes along with your proposals of of increasing to 2 years that it takes a while to catch on. To expect somebody to catch on, over a weekend, I think is a bit much, but that's just based on my experience.
Questions on Article 5? Mr. Block?
A few points, and I do appreciate Mr. DeGray's point of view. I think that it's valid, but I think that what Mr. Agave had begun to illustrate is important to consider. The entire recommendation as a whole, and I know you can't consider this question now, but from our perspective, a November election, if you were to approve a 7-member board with 3- and 2-year terms, actually provides more learned, experienced people at the time that a budget is considered than the current system now. You're going to have, if you have a 7-member board, 4 of those members are not going to be up for elections. You're going to have 4 people that have a minimum of a year experience and possibly 2 years experience with 3 years experience. And historically, when there are 3 seats, usually there's at least one person that's going to
Point of order?
Yes, Mr. DeGray, what's your point of order?
Well, we're discussing Article 5, and we keep referencing other articles that we have to take action on here today, which I deem is inappropriate at this point.
Well, Mr. Block is attempting to at least compare this article with another article, which, I mean, unfortunately, we have articles that are really together, and it's hard to not talk about a related article. And I would allow you to continue, subject to being brief as you can.
I won't rehash, but if you think about it from the holistic point of view of more than this one question, there's more experienced select board members. When you have a November election, a 7-member board turning only 3 of those over potentially on any one year, you're going to have at least 5 members on average that have experience, and more experience than you have now. Now, we have a March election. The 1-year seat candidates, if they're new, only have those 6 or 7 months. That's actually less time than those that have been seated for a 2-year period in a November board. And we've heard from several select board members, past and present, that it takes at least a year to get up to speed currently. So it's not necessarily an advantage from the perspective that Mr. DeGray illustrates. I also just want to address the other couple of points. It was raised that perhaps the only real advantage was a cost saving. I absolutely disagree. I think the historical records of voting in a nicer weather time of the year do support more citizen participation at the polls, and it does allow candidates to get out there, whether it's to run or to meet the people, much more transparently and actively than in the middle of the cold time of the year. Thank you.
Questions on Article 5? I'm going to recognize Mr. Eaton, Mr. Hanks, and Franks, I'm sorry, and Mr. Abatey. So if the other 2 want to come forward and sit in the seats, we'll hear Mr. Eaton.
Milton Eaton, 1. I move the question, please.
Motion's been made to move the question, cease debate. Is there a second? Second. All those in favor of ceasing debate, kindly stand and remain standing until counted. Those against? Ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of ceasing debate, 40. Those opposed, 52. And the motion is lost. Going back to the order, I'll recognize Mr. Hanks and then Mr. Beatty after Mr. Hanks. Geez,
He's got a
Mr.
typo.
Franks.
Tom Franks, District 3.
I apologize.
None necessary. I fail to see a rational connection between the number of select board members and the date of their election. I hear proponents of the Charter Change Commission, whose work I appreciate. It's a daunting task to take on a charter of many years. However, it is not a whole package. We do not vote on it as a whole package, and even if we did, when the 6, 7, 12, 43 members of the select board are elected, has nothing whatsoever to do with how many they are or their terms. It is, you have a calendar, if you have a 2-year term, it doesn't matter when you're elected, you're still on for 2 years. The issues that Mr. DeGray has raised, as whether you're building a budget, after 2 weeks experience in town government or after 7 months experience in town government, does not matter how many of you there are. You're still talking about the difference between an effective 7 months experience and 2 months experience. I think confounding the issue by saying it's a package and arguing for it on that basis I see no rational connection. Thank you.
Mr. Beatty?
Thank you. To me, the most significant issue here is how many people are voting. This is a democracy. Voters are important. Seems to me twice as many people could vote in November as would in March. I think that's really important, and I think that we really need to take that into account if the basis of what we're doing is democracy. Thanks.
Question is on Article 5, Mr. Harvey and then Mr. McCarty.
I think the number of people voting in an election is very important, but so is the quality of their knowledge. And putting this into the November election is going to make it very, very difficult for anybody to campaign toward an electorate that is going to work knowledgeably, because they're going to be very distracted by national issues. And so, although I would have originally voted in favor of this, listening to Lynn Coram and
Mr. DeGray.
Mr. DeGray, thank you, Mr. DeGray. And also considering these other things, I've come to the conclusion that what we need to do is to put this into exactly where it is.
Mr. McCarty. And on tap is Mr. Colpens.
Scott McCarty, District 3. Having been in politics for so long, I can tell you right now, I'm 25. My point is that weather has it's only a very small component of voter turnout. We all know that, okay? It was bitter cold in 2008, and we had huge turnout. Number one, because of the presidential primary that was going on, but number two, because of the interest in the candidates. So it has very little to do with the weather. It has more to do with the people's passion for the candidates and the people's interest in the issues. And there was a lot of interest going on, not just because of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and John McCain and all those people, but it was because of the select board and what was going on in the select board. So that was only part of it. I happen to agree with Dick and Len. I think that we would be doing a great disservice to the school board and the huge issues that they're going to be facing. And my other thing is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think this serves us well. This system serves us well. It's been a very effective use in terms of our resources. And I'd also like people to refer to the sheet that the town staff provided all the town meeting representatives. They really thought that there were a couple of, I'm not going to rehash what the document says, but I think they raised some serious cons about the prospect of this moving to November. So I would urge folks to vote no on this motion.
Dr. Kopens, then Mr. Sprite.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is one of the things I like about the select board is I couldn't tell you who on the select board is a Democrat or a Republican or a Liberty Union. And I think that serves our town well when we have the kind of conflict between political parties that exists, that it makes sense to have the election separate from that. So in fact, the people we are voting for are voted for because of the way they think about town issues, not because of their political affiliations.
Mr. Sprite?
I'm finding myself agreeing with everybody who's spoken so far. I was originally a strong proponent of the idea of moving it to the November things for the participation reason. One of the big things that stands out for me is the question of the high school board. That election happens on town meeting day, right? No, or March. So had there been any consideration of how that interplays with this issue among those on the Charter Commission? I guess that's my big question.
A member of the Charter Commission is interrogated. Mr. Gavi.
I don't have any recollection at all that the commission...
Mike?
Sorry. I don't have any recollection at all that the commission discussed the relationship between the high school elections and our other local elections.
Anyway, I think that's an important issue that perhaps if we are going to move it, needs to be actively considered and worked out. I also do like the idea, one of the reasons why I like the representative town meeting is because I feel like people come to it with a bigger commitment than the average town meeting and with a longer view. And I appreciate that as a town meeting member. And I'm concerned about that as to how the high school is governed, because I feel like those meetings are kind of random in terms of who shows up. So the informed electorate piece weighs in for me as well. So I'm still torn, but I'm leaning towards actually keeping it the way it is.
Question is on Article 5, Ms. Boubulas.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. When this was first proposed, I saw pros and cons. One of my biggest concerns was always that the local elections would get lost in the national elections. Having worked on campaigns and having seen how it works, even at the party level, this past election, you couldn't get anybody to pay attention to anything other than the governor's races, even the higher state offices. And the idea of having more people voting, yes, you do have more participation in the November elections, but I'm guessing the town clerk's office could tell you, and the BCA could tell you that there's a lot of people who don't vote for a lot of those lesser offices. So the idea of, the fact that there would actually be more people voting for the select board and town school board doesn't necessarily, hold true. And they're going to get lost. You're not going to see their signs. You're not going to see anything. And like Mr. McCarty said, you're not going to get any press for it. So, I find myself, I could have gone either way on this, but I really, the more I think about it, the more I think it's not a good idea.
Question is on Article 5, Dr. Tortolani.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Bob Tortolani, District 2. Move the question, please.
There's a motion made to cease debate. Is there a second? All in favor of ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of ceasing debate, 83. Those opposed, 14. Debate ceases. And the question is, shall the town election date be moved from the first Tuesday in March to the first Tuesday in November? All those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The noes have it, and the article is defeated. Article 6, shall the town increase the size of the select board from 5 to 7 members? Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town increase the size of the select board member from 5 to 7 members.
Is there a second? Motion is made and seconded that the town increase the size of the select board from 5 to 7 members. Mr. Block?
Thank you. Over the past 3 years, the commission has met and listened to officials from town government from various towns in Vermont, past and present Brattleboro Select Board members, various mayors and managers, and pretty much all of those folks led us to understand that the workload and complexity of small town governments has been steadily increasing over the past number of years. And to that end, one of the main reasons that the Commission recommends a 7-member select board is that we believe it will help better distribute the increased workload, and particularly on special projects that towns will from time to time face. And locally we've experienced some of those in the past, like the parking garage. We experience them now in the terms of the Union Station waterfront, the waste treatment plant, the district heating issue, and that a greater volunteer people power board would be able to address and become more learned in these matters. Now, that doesn't mean that all 7 members or all 5 members currently are able to be equally informed or attend committee meetings, but this would be able to give more people power to those types of projects and to face the increasing workload. We also think that a larger select board, in terms of numbers, will attract a greater diversity of candidates and ultimately ideas. We feel that currently the perception among some of the voters is that it's very difficult to get seated on the select board because familiar faces and incumbents have a much greater chance of becoming seated. We think that opening up the board to 7 members will attract perhaps those that heretofore have felt unsure as to whether they would be willing to take that step. Thank you.
Question is, shall we increase the Board of Selectmen from 5 to 7? Mr. Pillsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. As a person who sat on this board
for a couple of different times. I can tell you the workload isn't going to change. It's the amount of meetings that you have to go to that was my particular problem, and that's not going to change. You're still going to have to go to all the meetings, whether it's 7 of you or 5 of you. The committee work now, there's hardly any committee work. We pretty much leave it to the committees. We're ex officios. We try to just go between and try and bring back to the board what the committees were talking about. But there's very little committee work. I also feel, I know why they did this, and I'm for the reasoning behind it, because we want more participation. I think what's going to happen is you're going to get somebody not qualified sitting on that seat sometime. And I don't know what that means by qualified, not qualified, because you all become qualified after a while. But that's a chance where I think you're going to have somebody that just gets it because of the increased size. Right now, we have 3 people that have served for a while that aren't going to be here again. We have 3 openings for anybody out there who's never served before to come in, and this is your opportunity. I think that happens periodically. I will be voting no for the addition. And I also got to say, I think this is also, you're going to have 2 other people, and good or bad, because there's going to be people out there that think this is good, but you're going to have 2 other people with whatever their ideas may be going to the staff, which, believe it or not, is time-consuming for the staff. When 5 select board members now go up, you know, whenever, now you're going to have 7. And that can be good or bad. I'm just saying I think that's something else that needs to be considered. I'm going to be voting no on the addition of the 2 extra.
Question is, shall you increase the board from 5 to 7? Mr. Baboulas.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. A lot of people keep coming up to me over the last several months and saying, what do you think about this idea of increasing the size of the board? For people who haven't necessarily been paying attention to me, and there are some, I've been talking about this since long before I got on the board because I do think it will increase diversity. I think the idea of committee work, no, there aren't any committees on the select board because you can't have 3 people together right now without it being a quorum. But for all of us who serve on a lot of other boards, a lot of work gets done in committees, and it could actually allow the select board to do more in the same amount of time, and to really research things. So you can have a couple of members really researching something and coming back and saying to the select board, look at what we found. So I mean, I do think that it's a good idea. I think it will definitely increase diversity. And I think actually more people would be willing to put themselves out there to sit on a 7-member board. You really stick out on a 5-member board. You have to be, you know, and a 7-member board, it's like, you know, you're more likely to have an ally for your opinion. You're more likely to have people just sort of, you know, being willing to really take up the points that you're making, and I think that's a good thing. I do think that there is a lot of work to be done, and I do think that 7 makes sense. I'll yield the floor.
Question is, on the 5 to 7 member board, Mr. Dunbar? Dudman, I'm sorry, Dudman.
Another element which connects directly with the comments just made is there is always a carryover of 4 people in every election. That means there is sufficient institutional memory that stops the possibility of everything turning over every year and going from one extreme to another. The importance of institutional memory for stability, along with increased participation of point of view, is a critical issue, and that sits behind the 7-member idea.
Questions on increasing the size of the board? Ms. Tunis? Ernest?
Catherine Turnus, District 2. I have to take issue with what Darrell said. You know, when somebody is qualified to run for the select board, they have to be of age and voter. And not only are you just going to walk in and say, oh yeah, you're going to, they have to stand in front of the people in candidates' meetings. They have to be questioned by their neighbors. They have to be questioned by people in the town. So you're just not going to walk in. And what he means by qualified or unqualified, I'm sorry, but I would like that clarified.
Question is on increasing the size of the board. Ms. Tunis, did you want to have an answer from Mr. Pillsbury?
Yes.
Mr. Pillsbury's interrogated if he desires to be.
Actually, that's a very good question. What I mean by qualified, hey, listen, everybody's qualified. When I first got elected, I wasn't sure if I was qualified. All I'm saying is there's a lot of people that go to get in there. Somebody thinks that, let's say this year, there's 2 one-year seats available. Now let's say we're going to have, if we expanded it, well, we'd still have the 2 one-year seats because we're still only going to have 3. So, well, I just think you're going to have more people that can't answer that, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
Because you're right. I don't know. Everybody's qualified. I'm not saying nobody's qualified. I'm just saying that I think you could get somebody in there that just might slip in. And maybe the town didn't really want them, but if they get elected, fine. That's what I meant. I don't have a good explanation about it, to be honest with you.
Thank you, Gary.
Shall you change the board from 5 to 7, Mr. McCarty?
I feel like a candidate of no right now, but my whole concern, number one, is because of the select board salaries. I know it's little drops in the bucket, that kind of thing, but I'd rather see that money go to something else, like maybe, I don't know, the Parks and Rec Department, which I serve with on. But also there's the issue of lack of competition. You know, we don't see that much competition. But also, I think it's important that, you know, we talk about, we're going to be talking about, you know, the length of terms and all that. But sometimes it's necessary to have a wave and sweep some people out. Sometimes it is necessary. You know, we had it back in 2008. We've had it in the past. You know, I don't think the institutional memory is as important. We all have institutional memory because we're from Brattleboro and we know what's going on, and that's why we're all here today. So I don't really buy the issue of institutional memory. I am more concerned about having competent people in there, and I don't think enlarging the board is going to have any reflection on diversity. And if we wanted to enlarge something, I would say we enlarge representative town meeting. I'm stealing your idea, but I really do think that if we wanted to improve diversity, if we wanted to have more people involved in the process, then we enlarge representative town meeting and not the select board. I think our current select board size is sufficient. I've checked with communities all across Vermont. Many of them have the same size. Some of them have bigger select boards than the composite of what their town population is. So I think that our current select board size is sufficient. If we wanted to change something, I say we change the size of town meeting and enlarge that.
Question is, shall you increase the size of the Board of Selectmen from 5 to 7? Are you ready? Barb Sunday.
Well, we're asking for definitions. I'd like a definition of diversity. Several people have said this will increase diversity, and I'm just curious as to what that is defined by. What are you saying it's going to increase the age? It's the age diversity. Is it going to increase the gender diversity? Is it going to increase economic, socioeconomic? Is it going to increase political? Is it going to increase? I mean, I'm just curious as to what that is and what the goal is. I think that sometimes that gets thrown out, and people are afraid to say, "What do you mean by that?" And I'm curious as to what the definition of diversity is, and I'm also curious as by increasing the number, it's determined by who runs, and I'm curious as to how do you increase diversity by who's running, because to get elected you have to first run.
Member of the Charter Commission is interrogated. Mr. Block.
I think across the board it is likely to increase diversity. I think I stated previously, and I will repeat, that now I think incumbents and those people that are most able to spend the time and have the visibility to get elected are often the most elected candidates. I believe that people, in perceiving that the board is a little bit more diffuse, and perhaps, as someone had pointed out, they won't be quite as prominent in the discussion with a larger board. I'm not saying they'd be invisible, but I think it might attract some folks that have a little less experience, but have just as much dedication and just as much ability to get up to speed. And that would include a much wider range of folks that heretofore have not considered running for such a position.
Questions on Article 5? Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. You know, if you increase the board by 2 people, in the first election, you are going to have 2 open seats. And then after that, you're back to where you started. You may have incumbents running for who Larry just talked about have an unfair advantage. I can tell you in last year's election, Darrell Pillsbury unseated an incumbent. You decide who's going to sit here. It doesn't make any difference. When I look over this group here, and I look at our town, is this body here diverse? Ask yourself that. And Scott, I had mentioned this to Scott, we have 140 members. The charter was specific as to say to not increase the meeting members by more than 140. Well, how can you advocate for diversity on the select board but not advocate for diversity in town meeting members? A lack of consistency. I can tell you that adding 2 more board members is not going to change things. They're using percentages. The reality is you'd be adding 40% to the board, 2 new members. Institutional memory. In the last election in November, a lot of institutional memory got tossed out in Washington. It is what it is. If you want people to participate, I can't force you to go out and take a petition. This year we have contested races, and I'm trying to think that when we haven't really had contested races, more often it happens on the school board, which is too bad. In fact, I think there might be still a vacancy on the high school board that no one has taken out a petition yet. This board is pretty diverse. You elected this board. Adding 2 more people isn't going to change that. You can't change unless you put a definition of what you want for the makeup of the board. Do you want it to go by district? You want to have people from District 1, District 2, and District 3 hold 1 seat here. Different people have different definitions about diversity. This works. It has worked for as long as I've been paying attention to town government. It really works as a member of this board, and I strongly, strongly urge you to defeat this. Thank you.
Mr. Wessel.
Hi, Tim Wessel, District 3. As a partial answer to Barb, I wanted to just sort of lay out my definition of diversity as it relates to this question is I'd like to see more people running for the board who feel that they can afford to run for the board. And a working person might, like me, looks at the board and thinks about the huge workload that is, that the board has right now. And I really hope that a 7-member board can address that workload more efficiently than 5. And so, from my perspective, I'd like to run for the board someday, but I'm really daunted by being a member of a 5-member board, and I think 7 will effectively help diversity from an economic standpoint, because I think we get into a situation where a lot of the people who run for the board are people who can afford to go and run for that position, and I'd like to see more people who are on the fence about that.
Question is on Article 5. Ms. Baboulas?
I know that there are people on this board who strongly feel that this is a diverse board, and it is a diverse board. It is not a board that represents everyone in the community. And a 7-member board absolutely would be more likely to find people who at least represent more of people in the community. I mean, if you go out there and you talk to people, there's a lot of people who say, oh, you know, they don't, you know, they're not like me. And that's one of the reasons for the lack of participation. This actually could increase participation just on the basis that people feel more comfortable. It is also more likely that more people will feel comfortable, they will be able to find somebody that they can go to with concerns. And I do think that there are a lot of people out there that don't necessarily feel that there is a person right now on the board that they can go to. And, you know, I personally, you know, would have been comfortable. I was comfortable when I wasn't on the board talking to anyone on the board, but there's a lot of people who don't. And, you know, it's just about increasing the likelihood that there are going to be that there will be a person representing a certain sector in the community. You're not going to represent everything with 7 people, but it does increase the likelihood.
Mr. Dudman.
The issue of diversity is being short-circuited. Diversity is being looked at simply from the socioeconomic elements. The more critical issue of diversity is a broader set of points of view coming into the discussions that lead to the final decision that's made by the board. That's the more critical issue of diversity.
Ms. Sundag.
A couple of issues. About 3 years ago, there was a board member who I believe was running again and made the comment about how much time they spent with the board, and the immense amount of time they spent. That was the greatest disservice that ever occurred, I think, because the amount of time that person spent was by choice and not by necessarily necessity. I think that I'm hearing, and just as the town manager, I can tell you, it doesn't really impact me if I'm reporting to 5 or 7 people. To be honest, it's kind of still still the same to me. However, to hear people say, I can't run for the board because I won't have the time, there is an assumption out there, there is a misperception out there that this board takes a lot of time. They've talked about the various projects that we have going. We have a huge number of projects going on right now. However, we also have citizen committees. Now, Doris says that this would allow more time for the board members to go to those committee members. Should they be going? Should they be going to the citizen committees? Or does that, there's not a committee that is developed by the board that doesn't report back to the board or that makes its own decisions separate from the board. I would ask, I don't know if this would increase the number of people, you know, going from 5 to 7 increases the number of people sitting at the table. And I think it probably would increase the number, you know, I think you would probably have some different people running. You still don't have, although you're still having the same number of people running each year, you still have the same risk of having the incumbents continue to run. But I'm just not sure if, I think there's a misperception about if this body is spending hours every week doing their job, I'm not doing mine. And the other thing is, always remember, the world is run by those who show up. Kind of disappointed by the number of people who showed up today. There's like 2 meetings, 1 meeting usually every year where this body comes.
Questions on Article 6. Mr. Carlton.
Steve Carlton, District 3. Not quite sure how to put this, but what comes to me is, why are we so afraid of difference? Why are we so afraid of difference? In psychology and statistics, there's something called regression towards the mean. That means a tendency to sort of stay in a fairly fundamentalist, conservative, middle-of-the-road position. We may have, going back and forth, changes variability within the select board, and I think that's absolutely true. Yet, how is it that somehow women had not been involved in the national elections and so forth until relatively recently. How is it they only get the vote less than 100 years ago? Black representation. I think about Bernie Sanders and somehow, how is it that there's one or two progressive people that somehow manage in the powers that be to actually be in the Senate so that he has a chance to speak? That's my concern, I think, is that, let me tell you one more thing. When I was watching the CAX or VPR, I forget which one it was, Candidates Forum for Governor, I was absolutely blown out of the water by some of the bizarre, off-the-wall parties, like the marijuana party. That's not the Socialist Party, but, I don't know, there's 3 or 4 others. I can't even remember the name, along with the Liberty Union, of course. But some part of me said, boy, oh boy, these thoughts never come out. We never hear these kinds of thoughts anywhere. Once in a while, there's a splinter of statement that comes up somewhere, or they raise their head for a moment, and it may pop a bubble above the surface if the major media lets them in to their discussions. And I was tending to sort of go for staying with the 5, but I also realized that even though we do have these back and forth changes, we don't get the chance for someone, a splinter candidate, a really different candidate, to come out and have a voice, to be there. I don't think we have to be afraid that somehow they'll rock the boat so much. If it's somebody that's really bizarre and off the wall, that person's going to be marginalized by the other 6. So my sense is that we don't very often, within our institutional structures, have an opportunity for really minority people to speak, to be heard, and not just for one moment speaking at a select board meeting, but literally being there as part of the structure of the Senate or whatever. Women, blacks, gays. I think we ought to take the risk of giving people a chance to serve and serve well, and think that maybe they had something to offer to us.
Question is on Article 6. Are you ready for that question? Ms. McKinney?
I'm opposed to extending the select board to 7 members. I think it's a tough job, and I think that it's important that there be choice when we as voters make it. Elect select board. I think it works much better if there's a choice. And I think that the nature of the fact that it does take some time and a lot of commitment, it's going to be harder to have good choices with 7 because it's a tough job. I think there's a lot of opportunity for participation in town. And in fact, I think we need more participation. And I agree with Barb's comment about the size of this meeting. And I also feel that in terms of the ability to get elected, if somebody is interested in that and they serve on other town boards and so on, if they attend select board meetings and speak, I think there are ways to get out in front of the voters without having a select board that's 7 and therefore makes much more laborious the decision making that's in front of them.
Mr. Dudman, pardon me.
Good choices tends to be a code word for those who think the same way I do.
Question is on Article 6. Mrs. O'Connor.
This board does not need to expand. There are 5 of us, and we do not represent a certain segment. I'm here, and I don't feel that I should be always representing the senior citizen, although I am one, all right? I represent all the voters in Brattleboro. So for someone to say that we need board members to represent a certain segment, don't go there. That's wrong. It's unfair. Our governor doesn't represent a certain segment. He represents all the people. The president represents all the people. This board needs to represent all the people. I would also say, unfortunately, I work full-time, and I can fit in the duties of the select board. I have a boss that's very reasonable on occasion, so I can do it. But we are a working board, and I'm a working person. People can get in touch with me. I have a home phone number, and I have an office phone number. And I have never found anyone that didn't feel that they could call me and tell me what they thought. I may disagree with them, but we've had great conversations. We also, let's put in focus here. We have a #1 town manager here in the state of Vermont. That's her job. We have department heads that are long-term experienced department heads, and if we're not happy with the job that our town manager is doing or the department heads are doing, then let's say so. Let's just not put 7 members on a select board that 5 people can do that job. Thank you.
Mr. Davis.
Andy Davis, District 3. I have voted for people for a select board who wanted to run, who wanted to serve, and I believe they were qualified, and they lost. And that's a voice that could have been on the board. And I feel like if you want participation, you create more slots for participation. And the select board, I don't think it's such a big difference, 5 to 7, but it adds 2 more voices. We have people that want to serve on the board, and it's been rare that we've had unopposed seats for the select board. And just my personal experience, I think there are people out there that would fill those 2 seats who care about the town of Brattleboro and would represent everyone in the town. Thank you.
Ms. Boulis.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. First, a couple of clarifications. One is when I was talking about committees, I wasn't actually meaning that the select board would be working with the citizen committees. I was saying that the select board could potentially create a committee to work on something that may be a short term or something. So, you know,
Mr. Webster.
Well, I have. I'm responding. You know, there were a couple of things that were made, points that were made about something that I said.
All right. Mr. Webster, I have Ms. Boulis on this issue only having talked twice. So, yeah. And okay. Let me do it this way. Unless there's objection, we'll let Ms. Boulis talk this 3rd time, unless there's an objection. Okay. Sorry, Ms. Boulis. Okay. And Mr. Webster, do you want the floor for another reason too?
I happen to agree lots of what Martha said, that they are not special interests here. They're representing all the people. I think a board of 7 would also represent all the people. I don't see the distinction between the size, and I take Ms. Sontag's comments to order. I do have a question, though, for the board, for the committee, and it is this. There are a number of towns in Vermont, cities, who operate with governing bodies more than 5. And I know that the committee asked a number of people, experts, to come down from various communities to talk about that experience. I'm sort of curious if any of those boards, like Burlington or Montpelier or Rutland or other places similar size that have larger bodies, have suffered because they had larger bodies. It just strikes me that, I guess I'm indicating my own preference, but I would like to ask if indeed you had any sense of whether it was a problem if towns moved from 5 to 7 people. My own feeling is, along the line of the movie, if we build it, they will come. We will have new, good candidates running for office.
Member of the Charter Commission's interrogated. Mr. Block?
We didn't hear, that I can recall, from any town official outside of Brattleboro that there was such an issue. The only thing we did experience a few times, that there was a little friction in communities that had a mayoral system, which is not central to this discussion, but was an interesting find on our part that perhaps compelled us to not go too far into that recommendation. But no, we did not hear such complaint.
Mr. Penniman?
I'm listening. We have one proposal here about the number of people. We also have a proposal about the length of terms. And when I hear the term that they're trying to get more diverse board, that would indicate to me you want more candidates running at one time so that a less mainstream person has a better chance of being on the board to present those other ideas. But if you look at these two articles, you expand the board, but you expand the terms, you're still going to have 2 or 3 people in an election, and the chances for a non-mainstream person to get in are not going to change. So while we're looking at an article at a time, they seem to be contradictory in opening up for the diversity issue. Thank you.
Question is on the Article 6, 5 to 7 year term. This young lady next to Mrs. Henry. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Sarah Page, District 2. I tend to agree that a greater number of people on the board increases diversity. However, that gets defined by the individual. It just, statistically speaking, you have a greater number of people on the board, you're more likely to get a greater number of perspectives. I also feel, as a person who is a little intimidated by thinking of running for the board, I would feel more inclined to, if I felt that there were a greater number of people with greater experience than me, because I wouldn't feel so much in the spotlight and having to know everything about everything as I step onto a board. So I think a higher number of people means there are going to be a higher number of experienced people. And I would think that it would operate more smoothly because of that.
Questions on changing the size of the board? Mr. Coram.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm really concerned about Ms. Page's last comment about, not everyone on the board trying to know everything that there is to know that every board member should know. I think they should. I think what happens, and I mentioned this to one of the reasons that hasn't been brought up here in terms of having going from 5 to 7, and I think we should remain at 5, is what happens is, I think will happen, because it's happened here today. We have 140 members, but 100 are here. Now, some of those people cannot, those other 40 or 45 members cannot legitimately make it. But it also may be, well, I don't really need to go to that. I've got other members will go. I'm afraid of the same thing happening with 7 members. With 5 members, for the 3 years, almost 3 years, as of the end of next month, that I've been on the board, I have purposely made my schedule such that I will try to get to every meeting that we have, whether it's a special meeting or the regular meetings on Tuesday evenings. If there were 7 people, and I consider myself a fairly conscientious person, but I think if there were 7 people, even I, and I'm sure some others, would just say, well, I don't really need to go tonight. I'd just as soon be on my bike. It's a beautiful 70-degree day in the summer, and I just won't, on a Tuesday night, I'd just as soon go out and ride my bike. I think that's going to happen. I think that can happen, and we've got to recognize that that's part of human nature. So I think 5 can do it. There are 3 of us that are working full-time. We've been able to work and do the work that the board is needed to have done. So I would hope that you would vote this down. Thank you.
Dr. Todorlani?
Thank you. Bob Tortolani, District 2. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I actually wanted to get Jesse Coram's opinion because he was the only one of the sitting members who hadn't given his opinion. and he already gave his opinion, so thank you.
Okay, now, Mr. Dudman has spoken twice. Unless there's objection, I'm going to allow him to speak a third time. Mr. Dudman.
The central element in Mr. Corum's comment is that others would not be anywhere near as conscientious as he. That is the most fallacious argument I have ever heard.
Mr. Moderator, if I
Mr.
might
Corum.
respond, that was not my intent or what I said.
I think we're getting to a time where maybe we ought to change the subject. Mr. Franks.
Tom Franks, District 3. Just a few points. We've heard a lot of "I think." This will. I haven't heard a lot of facts, actually experience, about diversity, larger, how any of this will change. There was a comment, and I can't remember who made it, about statistically. Statistics are often talked about. They're very rarely understood in my experience, and I get paid to do that. And I don't understand them. But let me just share a little thing with you. It's called self-selection bias. Take a look around the room. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, you can see I am male, I am white. In case you couldn't guess, I'll tell you I qualify as middle class. Who else is here? Oh, yeah, let's not forget old. Middle-aged, middle class, middle income, white. Okay, we have around the room 100 members present. Give or take one of those factors, there's not a lot of diversity here. So I'm not sure how adding 2 more members to the select board is going to change diversity. We were talking about statistics. Statistically, you add more people, you get a greater diversity. There's another thing in statistics called self-selection bias. Anytime you do a research, you're trying to figure something out, you have to accommodate that because only certain people will show up. Only certain people will respond to your survey. Only certain people have a desire to run, no matter how many seats you have. So diversity is a high and noble goal, but we don't really know how to achieve it. And if we try and say that, 2 more members will achieve that, I don't know that you have any facts to prove that. Thank you.
Mr. Block?
We've heard now a couple of times that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, or prove diversity in advance. I think that one thing that we need to bear in mind, particularly this representative body, is that this is an experiment, not a certainty. And if in a worst-case world, something that is brought forth today that is approved and agreed to that creates change tends not to work and is visibly a bad idea after the fact, the authority to change it back is yours. You can bring forth a charter question yourself, have it voted on, and decided. The Select Board has the same authority. So I think the greater risk is in not taking a chance sometimes to seeing if a better idea might work, instead of saying, well, I can't tell that it's going to work, so we're not going to change anything. Thank you.
Question is on Article 6. Now, Mr. DeGray's spoken
Once.
You're correct. Mr. DeGray. Yes.
Steve Phillips, District 3. As interesting as it is to hear the debate between the Commission and the Select Board, I'd like to hear from the town meeting reps, and our rules say that no voter who has spoken once shall speak again to the exclusion of another. So I just asked the moderator to enforce that rule.
I didn't see anybody's hand up.
There was
This Zach, and then let me call out the next one. There was a lady behind you. Next to Mr. Ellis. Mr. Wessel. Young lady, yes. Why don't you get up in the batter's box, as they say. And Mr. Tunis.
Deb Zach, District 2. I don't have strong feelings one way or the other about expanding the select board. What's important to me is that the board be able to work through conflict, that they collaborate, and that they listen to the town members who show up at the meetings. However, if we are going to expand the select board, there is one area that I feel that is not strongly represented in our town, and that's our youth population. And I think it would be very interesting to reserve one of those seats if we expand for youth. So just an idea. I'll throw it out there. Thanks.
Hi, Catherine Wilson. I am District 2. And I just wanted to say that for me, expansion of the board is more about something that is how it functions, which is that there was an issue that came in front of the board during the summer 2 years ago, and at least one of the members was on vacation. And you know, I want to be able to give the select board the opportunity to have the life that they deserve, even as an elected official. But it meant that things turned out a little bit differently than I think it would have if the whole board had been there. And so this is one of the reasons I think it's so important to have a larger board, so that there are more people seeing every issue every time.
Ms. Turnus?
Catherine Turnus, District 2. I just want to present the fact that our last election there was an amazing woman who ran for the select board, Leah, who actually did pull in a good amount of votes. And if we had had a 7-seating board, she probably would be on the board. And she actually represented a part of our community that is not represented.
Mr. Harvey?
George Harvey, District 3. I'm an engineer, and one of the things that has bothered me about the board in the past is the fact that there are one-year terms on it. And I don't see how we can change that. The reason why it's bothered me is because I have heard many times that it takes a year for a person to get up to speed, which means that he's facing his re-election or leaving the board just as he gets up to speed. I don't see a way of getting past the one-year term to a 2-year term without increasing the size of the board. And I think that's important. Another thing that I'd like to mention is that I have heard from people in Brattleboro complaints, justified or not, that the board seems to be of one mind and is not sufficiently diverse. And the reason, of course, behind this is because 3 people vote the same way. Well, of course 3 people are going to vote the same way. It's inevitable in every election that they make on the board. But nevertheless, there is a perception that it's possible for 3 people to lock that board up, and that's all you need. And for that reason, I think I would favor going to a 7-member board.
Mr. Wilmerding?
John Wilmerding, District 3. I took a decision to run for Select Board this year, and let me tell you, it's not a decision one should take lightly. You have to talk with your wife. You need to know your children are going to release you to do this work. You're not going to be around home as much. I also feel that people on the Select Board feel a much greater onus to do work on behalf of the town, and that's my motivation for running. I think that it's going to feel not only more inclusive of different points of view, but it's going to feel like you have more people who can go to different committee meetings and monitor and keep the pulse on what the feelings are of the people in the town and what the business of the town is if you increase the size to 7. And so I favor that, and I thank you for this chance to speak.
Mr. Beatty?
I don't think that democracy is working that well in Brattleboro. I mean, I look at a third of the body here that isn't here today. I look at the select board that for the first time in my memory over the past 15 years, there are no incumbents running. I just, you know, can we say that things are working so well? Can we say that a 7-member board is just such a bad idea that it's not worth trying just to shake things up? I think that with a 7-member board, as somebody recently said, you won't have lockdowns, you'll have more swing votes, there'll be more debates. I have often found it incredible how little debate there is on the select board. If you bring up an idea that the chair doesn't like, that a couple of other people don't like, you can't even get it on the agenda. I think we need a larger select board. I think we need to move towards more democracy. Democracy isn't easy. We're all sitting here today. We know that. So I'm going to vote for this. Thank you.
Question on Mr. Agavi.
For me, it's sort of about hope. I have been intimately involved with municipal affairs now for 12 or 14 years on all levels, from all perspectives, and I am very much aware of what life is like in this town, and there is nothing happening right now that gives me hope that there is substantial or significant, even worthwhile change in our immediate future, maybe even the long-term future. I cannot accept the argument that we cannot do better than we have, than we are. If things are going to be different, if we are going to change directions, it means changing something. It may not work. We'll change it again. At least we will have learned what does not work. Maybe the next time after doing this, we'll say we do need a mayor. I don't know if that'll work or not, and nobody who will ever argue that will know beforehand that it will work. But it's a change, and if there is going to be hope that in these years coming right down the pipe, the pike, we have to do things differently.
Question is on Article 6. Mr. Underhill. Mr. Underhill moves to cease debate. Are you ready for that question? Is there a second? I'm sorry. Okay. All in favor of ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing till counted. Those opposed to ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of ceasing debate, 65. Those opposed, 33. And the number to cease debate that was needed is 65, so debate ceases. And the recurring question is, all those in favor of changing the select board from 5 to 7, rise and remain standing until counted.
Point of order. Your math is better than mine. Doesn't it require 6? Yes. 2/3 of those votes. Don't you have to have 66?
I got to yield to my calculator here. Town clerk.
There were 98. There were 98 voting. 65 were yes and 33 were no. So 66. Two-thirds is exactly 65.
Of those present and voting. Of those voting, yes.
Not everyone voted.
Yeah. Okay.
You actually need 65 and a third, and 65 is not 65 and a third.
So the people who didn't vote, did they abstain?
It's not 65, 33. Point of order, Mr. Moderator. I don't even have any idea what I'm standing up for.
Well, you because you're for the bill. You're for the bill. You're voting yes.
That's what
Yeah.
I've been saying, is it got so confused in terms of...
All right. Why don't we start all over here? We had 98 votes, 65 in favor of ceasing debate, 33 against, and well, I.
Well, it's part of the voting process. We don't have a third.
Yeah. Well, why don't we do it this way to make it so that we get this particular vote off the record, and that is, does someone care to make the motion that the ruling of the chair be challenged? Yes, sir. Dr. Copens. All right. All in favor of, in effect, saying that the ruling of the chair and the count was illegal and not binding, say aye. No, stand. Got to have you stand.
Not illegal, but incorrect.
Incorrect. Okay. All those opposed to overruling the incorrect vote?
Voting to continue the debate.
The chair,
Right.
yes.
2/3 achieved, and mathematically there wasn't, then I don't see the purpose of what we're doing.
There was 65 to 33, and if you do it without the fraction, there was 65. Not when we don't have a third. Is there a third out there somewhere?
Excuse, Mr. Moderator, can I just say something that might help people? No, I just want to remind people that there is a potential for many of these things to end up being petitioned to go to a town-wide vote, and so no, I'm not going to move I'm not going to move the question or anything. But what I'm saying is that let's not get bogged down in sort of getting at an impasse with arguing about things.
Mr. Harvey.
In this particular case, I'm afraid this issue could be challenged after this meeting, and that whatever subsequent votes taken could be challenged, possibly in court, because the mathematics didn't work out the way somebody else wants it to work out. I think we should take the time to go ahead on this issue until we've got it done.
Mr. Moderator, if you would like to take the vote again?
Yeah.
Take the vote again?
I'd like to move the question again.
Reconsider the vote.
Reconsider the vote.
Okay. Okay. All in favor of reconsidering the vote, kindly rise. Those opposed, kindly rise. Okay. We will reconsider the vote, and the vote will be, shall we cease debate on Article 6, which is the 5 to 7 board change for the Select Board? All in favor of ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted.
I was going to leave it. I'm going to come back Monday and Tuesday.
Seats. Yeah. All those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of ceasing debate, 74. Those opposed, 21. So debate has ceased, and it was a total vote of 95. The question now is, shall you adopt Article 6 to change the board from 5 members to 7 members on the Board of Selectmen? All those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of Article 6, 43. Those opposed, 53. The article has been defeated. We'll now take up Article 6. 7. And the chair recognizes Ms. Baboulas.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town change the terms of the select board members to 4 two-year terms and 3 three-year terms. And I'm guessing we have to change the language of this motion, or are we?
Is there a second to that motion? Motion has been made and seconded that the town change the terms of the select board members to 4 two-year terms and 3 three-year terms. Mr. Block?
As stated, of course, the question is moot because a 7-member board has just been turned down. So I don't know if I can speak to anything other than the specific question here, which is impossible to achieve unless an amendment is offered.
Mr. Sprite?
I'm not sure whether this would make an appropriate amendment or just vote this thing down, but I would like to propose that we keep the terms as they are. So, I guess I'm proposing that we vote it down then.
Okay, I understand. Mr. Cummings?
Chuck Cummings, District 1. I move the question.
Second. Mr. Cummings moves to cease debate. All those in ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Yes, ma'am. Point of order. The question's been called, and the vote is either yes for it or no. Those opposed to ceasing debate, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of ceasing debate, 51. Those opposed, 24. And 49 votes were necessary to achieve the two-thirds vote. So we have ceased debate. And the question is, on the question as presented, shall the town change the terms of the select board members to 4 two-year terms and 3 three-year terms? All in favor, kindly rise. All opposed, kindly rise. The article has been defeated. Article 8, shall the town increase the size? Mr. Franks.
I'd like to call for reconsideration. To repeat it? Yeah. I voted no, so I can't. Okay. Can I raise an issue? Okay.
Mr. Franks.
Thank you. I'm not sure how this fits into our process, but it seems to me that we voted not to increase the size of the select board. If we had approved the Article 7, we would have effectively increased the size of the select board without increasing the size of the select board, which I think would have been slightly confusing. However, I feel we had an issue before us, which was the terms that we, by our action, completely ignored. Whether there was any there was no discussion of the value of having the terms changed regardless of the size, which I believe is a valid issue, and I regret the lack of opportunity to discuss that issue. So begging the indulgence of this body, and if it is permissible, I would like to propose that we discuss amending the term limits of our current select board to 2-year terms and 3-year terms in some ratio to be discussed. And I make that a motion.
It's out of order.
But then we'd have to reconsider the motion. Okay, I motion that we reconsider the last vote, and subsequent to that, that we reconsider the vote to cease debate. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Franks, if it's a reconsideration, can you assure the chair that you voted with the affirmative on the question when it was originally presented?
I voted with the prevailing side.
Then I can't accept that reconsideration.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Okay. The question is on Article 8. The chair recognizes Mr. Pillsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town increases the size of the school board from 5 to 7 members.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Block?
Well, this hopefully won't take that much time because this was a much more lukewarm recommendation on the part of the commission. For we found in interviewing school board members that the workload was not steadily increasing and the scope of that work more narrow. And our main reason for recommending it, well, our two reasons were, again, the diversity of ideas and candidates, as well as we felt that on a few issues that it was more important for this to be brought forward for debate than for us to hold it back when there was enough support for the idea. So, leave it in your hands.
The question is on Article 8 to increase the size of the school board from 5 to 7 members. Is there any further discussion on that? Okay, all in favor signify by standing. All opposed signify by standing. The article is defeated. Article 9, Chair recognizes Mr. Coram.
Mr. Moderator, I move that the town change the terms of the school directors to 4 two-year terms and 3 three-year terms.
Motion has been made and seconded that the town change the terms of school directors to 4 two-year terms and 3 three-year terms. Mr. Block.
Again, lacking amendment, this question is moot.
Are you ready for the question? Mr. Underhill. Underwood. Yes.
I actually wanted to do this with the select board, but I figure if we do it here, maybe we can somehow get back to where we were. Is I'd like to change this to have the terms be 2 three-year terms, 2 two-year terms, 1 one-year term. And if I figured it out correctly, that will only leave, I think most years, it will put 2 vacancies on any of the boards. So there won't be as much turnover as people had been talking about before, where some years we have 3. I think over a 5-year period, there may be 1 year that we have 3. But it would eliminate some of that problem. If we can do it for this, I hope that we can go back and also consider the idea for the select board. Thank you.
Now,
so I make that amendment. Thank you.
is there a second to the amendment?
If I'm allowed to, then, as Dart said, then I would also like to amend that for the select board too, please.
Well, let's take it up here first with the school board. Can you, Mr. Do you have that written down? Why don't you repeat it if you would?
For the 5 seats, we have 2 three-year terms, 2 two-year terms, 1 one-year term.
Okay.
Now, how we implement that on future, et cetera, elections will have to be decided, but...
Mr. Moderator? Looking at it quickly, you are still going to end up with 3 people, because you end up having automatically the 1-year seat always up, and then you are going to have a 2-year seat or a 3-year seat, and even if you had the 2 3-year seats and a 1-year seat up, even though you stagger them, you're going to have a 2-year seat up, a 1-year seat up, because you're going to try to stagger the people. You will still end up with the boards having 3 people change the vote with this amendment here.
Ms. Atkinson?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Margaret Atkinson, District 2, and I'm currently the chair of the town school board. First, Thanks to the Commission for their work. I know it's a hard and thankless task. On this question of changing the terms, currently we have 3-year terms and 1-year terms. At this time, there are 3 seats open. And as far as I know, maybe there's 3 candidates for those seats. I'm not sure. But this perceived problem of turnover somehow making institutional memory going away on a town board just seems like a false problem. We have a policy governance board, and we have an extraordinary staff, a superintendent, principals, central office. They are the institutional memory, and they are answerable to us. So there's a lot of room on our board, which I believe is a highly functional one, for new people to come on, get up to speed, contribute as they want to, contribute their views, and learn. We have not had a problem with either an overabundance of incumbency or a lack of institutional memory. So I would ask, and as an aside, to be monkeying around with the terms on this board to get some kind of symmetry on the other board, I just, now that question has been settled, seems to me maybe not the best use of this body's time. And that is my opinion, not the opinion of the school board. So I would ask that this body just defeat this amendment and move on. Thank you.
Mr. Scholes?
Scholes.
Scholes?
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I'm one of the 1-year candidates. I'm finishing my 2nd year, and many of you signed my petition for a 3rd. Thank you. And the only thing I would like to add to what Margaret said is that there's a significant value to having to come to the voters every year and get this thing signed. People ask you questions about the school. They ask you questions about why you're running. They ask you questions about whether 1 year is a good model or not. And I think that that's valuable. People have spoken a lot about the importance of democracy. There's nothing more democratic than having to come to people and ask them to sign a petition to let you run. So again, I think our system is working well. I think the number 5 is perfect. I'm glad we don't have to deal with that for this kind of a policy board. And I think that the opportunity to address the public regularly is important. So I urge you not to change it.
Question is on Article 9 to change, as recommended by Mr. Underhill, the terms. Oh, Mrs. Coram, I'm sorry. I couldn't figure out who had the hand. You or Mr. Everett?
Lynn Coram, District 3. I think we're confusing a little term limits with the length of terms. If you want to, this is not a term limiting thing. If you want to run again for 2 years, you just run again. So all those factors are still in there, and I think we're trying to make a problem where there isn't one.
Question is on Article 9. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Steve Phillips, District 3. I'd urge that we defeat this amendment. My biggest concern is not what the terms are. It seems to me that this hasn't been warned. The way the warning reads, at least the warning that I have, talks about specific terms, and these are not those. The ones in the amendment are not the ones in the warning. So and that I could interrogate Attorney Fisher on that.
Mr. Fisher's interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. These articles can be amended, and albeit they have been warned based on just to go backwards for a second, these articles 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 were originally proposed to be one article, and they were split out into 2 articles so that the debate would be specific to each half of the question. So with the defeat of Article 8, with regard to the Article 9, those terms can be amended because the terms of, it's the issue of the terms which is the issue that has been warned, and that can be amended.
Question is, shall you adopt the article as amended by Mr. Underhill. Are you ready for that question? Mr. DeGray.
The three years and the 2 one-year seats that we presently have in place, I think fits our town quite well. If you look at this year's election, at least for the Select Board, there are several candidates for both positions. And I think that that one-year position gives people an opportunity, a couple of people an opportunity to get on the board and see if this is something that they truly thought it was going to be. And one of the things, at least from my institutional memory, is that more often than not, you have people who have run for the one-year seat then flip over to the 3-year seat, and vice versa. People from the 3-year seat. I certainly was an exception there, is that I have ran for 2 3-year seats. So I'm going to hope that you defeat this, and I applaud Ben for trying to do something. But this is a system here that I think is working very well for our community, just like the size of the board and just like the March election. And it's good to have debate, but I think that, you know, the 3 people turning over is fine, and there is another way to do it, but I'm not in favor of it. And so I hope that you defeat this motion.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 9 and as amended, or adopt the amendment first? That's the first question. Are you ready for that question? All those in favor of amending Article 9 as recommended by Mr. Underhill, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Can you repeat the amendment? Yes. The amendment is that the town change the terms of the school directors to 2 3-year terms, 2 2-year terms, and 1 1-year term. All those in favor? Kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed? The amendment is defeated. The recurring question now comes, shall you adopt the article as warned, that the terms be for school directors 4 2-year terms and 3 3-year terms? Are you ready for that question? All those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise. And you have defeated Article 9. Article 10.
Mr. Moderator?
Article 10, the chair recognizes Mrs. O'Connor.
Mr. Moderator, I move that the town prohibit the use of electronic voting in Australian ballot voting, retaining the use of paper ballots for all Australian ballot voting.
Is there a second? Motion has been made and seconded that the town prohibit the use of electronic voting in Australia ballot vote, retaining the use of paper ballots for all Australian ballot voting. Mr. Block.
This provision reflects our current practice here in Brattleboro, but it embeds, more importantly, the charter directive to retain this form of voting. And since there's no real likelihood that the population of Brattleboro is going to change dramatically over the next 15 years or so, we feel it's important to place this in the charter so that if there was a movement to change our voting system, that it would be more deliberatively done and not just done at a whim. So it really just restates, but places in the charter, what our voting system currently is.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 10 as recommended? Mr. Everett?
Mr. Moderator, Dart Everett, District 3. This says the town, and it says Australian ballot, so I assume it would include all voting for all officers at all elections, the way it's written.
Member of the Charter Committee is interrogated.
The answer is yes.
Mr. Everett?
But that is not how we currently do it. When we go to the ballots on election day, we use an electronic ballot.
No.
Oh, okay.
It's not considered that. This
Okay,
is.
okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Cook?
Hillary Cook, District 3, which goes along with the confusion DART has, is that I think we need to, even though this is the way in which we are currently electing our local officials, shouldn't we define what electronic voting is so that there's something going forward that gives people for the next 15 years or so until the next charter review some definition to what electronic medical records. Yeah, that's my other job. So you understand what I'm where I'm getting at. Thanks.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 10 as recommended by the Charter Committee? Any further discussion? Mr. Sprite?
I'd like to speak in favor of this. I think it's urgent that we pass this. I am personally uncomfortable with the fact that Diebold has anything to do with our elections whatsoever, and if I'm not going to offer an amendment, but I feel uncomfortable enough with the tabulators, and if we did not have a paper record that backs up what we did, I would be very concerned for our democracy. I think Florida has shown a horrible example of what can happen among many other places. No, in Dade County, it's no paper ballot. There is no permanent record of what happened, and there's no way of verifying what what the vote actually was and what got messed with.
Mr. Block?
There's a little confusion here with the language that is written into the revised charter, and I'd like to read it very briefly because it might clear up those that were concerned about the definition of the term electronic voting. I'll quote from the revised charter. The Australian ballot system for election of officers shall require the use of printed ballots. Such ballots shall be retained to ensure that a verifiable record of all votes taken is preserved and available in the event of a challenge or recount. That is our recommendation. Nowhere in that paragraph is the word electronic.
Question is on Article 10. Mr. Georges?
George Herzog, District 1. I think we assume that I know that lots of horror stories about electronic ballots, and we are not talking about putting them in place right now. And we assume that the people in the future will be complete dummy, and we have to protect them from such an evil as electronic ballots. And I guess if we ever consider electronic ballots, people will know what they do about it, and we have to place our hopes that they do. Thank you.
Question is on Article 10. Mr. Copans?
You know, there's a long tradition of cheating in elections with paper ballots as well, having relatives who bragged about voting, 15 times for a governor of South Carolina, riding from town to town. And I wonder if we're confusing dishonesty with technology, since if we really care about democracy, the notion, in fact, of voting through email, if appropriate safeguards are built in, is something that may in fact encourage and get a lot more people to participate in the democratic process. And I wonder if we really are confusing our concern about honesty and dishonesty with our concern about technology.
Question is on Article 10. Mr. Harvey?
George Harvey, District 3. I mentioned the last time I was up here that I was an engineer. I am a computer engineer. And I can tell you that it is possible to read material being moved from one place to another on a hard drive in a computer from across the street in a parked car that is not connected to the computer at all. You can change information remotely. In order to be able to be sure that this does not happen, I think that it's very important that this be written into the charter, because if it isn't, then theoretically it would be possible for such a change to be made by a body of people who have not fully considered the issue. And it is frightening to me to think about the idea of email or computer transfers of any kind, computer tabulation that does not have a paper backup being done, because, quite frankly, the election could be thrown by somebody who is not running for office, who is not a member of the town, who is not even part of the process. And it could be done for any reason whatever, including hacking, because it's fun. This is a real prospect to have an election thrown. And I think that it is very important that we have sufficient retention, an audit trace, if necessary, of the process.
Question is on Article 10. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor of amending Article 10 or of passing Article 10 to prohibit the use of electronic voting in Australian ballot voting, retaining the use of paper ballots for all Australian ballot voting, kindly rise and remain standing till counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The ayes have it, and you've adopted Article 10. Now, okay. Article 11. To see if the town, Article 11, Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town require write-in candidates to declare their candidacy no later than 1 hour prior to the close of polls.
Is there a second? Second. Motion has been made that the town require write-in candidates to declare their candidacy no later than 1 hour prior to the close of the polls. Mr. Blott.
I would like to ask our town clerk, Mrs. Cappy, to address the town meeting members on this question. Here.
Oh, you're on. Yeah. Thank you. There were handout sheets in the back today, which were also the same as were there Wednesday night. So if you've read those, I don't have anything new to add to that. If you were not able to come Wednesday night, the main reason for doing this is so that we
as ballot counters at the end of an election, can more accurately and efficiently count write-in votes. We currently have many, many write-in votes that don't amount to anything, but that's not really the issue. It's a sort of an aside of that. The main issue is that we feel that there are probably a lot of write-in candidates whose votes for them do not get counted because we don't recognize them. One of the example that I gave the other night was on, I'm going to use you again, Mr. Truhan, Mark Truhan. Unless the name is the same as we have on the voter checklist, we don't always know who it is. Someone may write in Mark Truhan 25 times and Stephen Truhan, which is the way we have Mr. Truhan on the voter checklist, 5 times. He wouldn't win when we count that way because we would not have associated the two names as being the same person. Oftentimes we do recognize names, but we don't know all of the 9,000 people on our voter checklist. So this would help a person who is interested in being a write-in candidate by declaring their candidacy, and it's not a big issue to declare. Just let those in the presiding officer at the election know by signing a paper, this is who I am, and I choose to accept this position, and I want to be considered. So we know to look for your name. And if your name is Stephen Mark Truhan, then we know to look for Stephen, we know to look for Mark. We have all kinds of last names. We may have, Mary W. Smith, we may get M.W. Smith. We don't know that that's Mary W. Smith, but if Mary W. Smith has declared her candidacy, we know to give M.W.'s vote to Mary. So this is a way of hopefully trying to help a write-in candidate be elected. And it also, I think, I know there are those who feel that they should be able to write in and start a campaign for a different person. But unless that person accepts the responsibility, if you want to write in John Smith as a write-in candidate and there are 30 people who do that, there's no guarantee that John Smith wants that position. And if Mr. Smith refuses it, then it is not going to be an elected position. It will be an appointed position. So you have actually lost your vote and had it appointed. So unless there are questions, that's pretty much the reasoning behind this. And this was only for town elections, and it has the support of the Director of Elections of the state of Vermont.
Question is on Article 11. Mr. Sprite.
With all due respect to our most extraordinary and lovely town clerk, I would like to amend this to say by the time the polls close. And I'd like to speak to that.
Okay, Mr. Sprite moves that the article be amended by striking out no later than 1 hour, striking out the words no later than 1 hour so that it would read, town require write-in candidates to declare their candidacy prior to the close of the polls.
Correct.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion?
Mr.
Sprite?
It is partly to support my interest in democracy in general, and it's also a result of my own personal experience, which I think several of you have heard already, which is the first election that I won here in Brattleboro was as a result of being a write-in, and I started my write-in campaign probably 45 minutes before the polls closed. Upon arriving and finding that there was a one-year term as a town meeting rep that was left open with no candidates. So I would not have been a valid candidate at that point already. So I urge you to make her job a little harder, unfortunately, but in support of democracy here. Thank you.
Question is, shall you amend the article as recommended by Mr. Sprite? Are you ready for that question? Miss Boulis.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I have real concerns about this just because the voters have a right to vote for whomever they want. Now, that candidate that they vote for may not accept it, but they have that right to vote for them. And the concern I have is codifying something that should just be a matter of policy. I mean, this is essentially our Constitution, and I don't think you need to have this in here. It's just an FYI. If people are going to mount a write-in campaign, that they should let the town clerk's office and the BCA know that they're going to do it.
Question is on the amendment proposed by Mr. Sprite. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Pillsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Well, my concern is for this body right here, town meeting members, because we're probably going to come up here shortly and we're going to say, okay, we got 4 or 5 more openings left. And I remember when Frick did do that, and he stood at the polls. He says, hey, I'm going to be a write-in candidate, and then we got to fill in one of the seats for District 2. So I'm more concerned with the town meeting members because, there's going to be a few of them open, and that's my concern.
Question is, shall you amend the article as recommended by Mr. Sprite? Mr. Davis.
Just a point of Andy Davis, District 3. Annette, if somebody didn't come and announce that they were writing, but they might not even be in town, but there was a groundswell of support to put this person in a position, there was no confusion about their name, they received 75 votes, would they then not be eligible to take that seat?
Town clerk is interrogated.
Under the new proposal, no, they would not be able to take the seat.
Yeah, in that case, I would just highlight what Dora Bubala said, that it takes away the sovereignty of the voter. I would vote against this. Thank you.
Question is on the amendment as recommended by Mr. Sprite. Mr. Beatty.
I think the reason that this amendment came forward is that, for quite a while now, people have been. Somebody say something?
Did you?
Andy was speaking to the underlying question.
And the amendment.
Okay.
Okay, you may proceed.
That for a number of years now, people have been, just writing down frivolous names. And that's fine, it's cute. But the town clerk and the vote counters spend hours and hours and hours tabulating frivolous names. And, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of time. And it's cute to read it on Brattleboro once or twice, but, even that gets old. So the one argument that I've heard that impresses me is the one about town meeting reps. But if you want to be a town meeting rep and there's openings, you can go to the caucus of your district and easily get appointed. I don't think that's a big issue. And I don't think that people announcing that, even with a phone call, if they're out of state, that they're willing to accept is, if somebody wants to mount a writing campaign, I think it's incumbent upon them to have that level of organization. Thank you.
Question is on the amendment as proposed by Mr. Sprite. Mr. Cummings.
Chuck Cummings, District 1. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm going to vote yes on the amendment because I think it's important that if it's to be adopted, if this article is to be adopted, that we give people every opportunity to put their name in. Having said that, and being for the amendment, I am opposed to the article because I think it takes away one of our rights, and that is to vote for whom we wish. And this doesn't let us do that. I understand the problem that the town clerks had, but I think it's important that we keep our right. And so if a person is elected or gets a sufficient number of votes and hasn't even been asked, and then is asked, there will be an appointment if he doesn't take it, or she. But if there is a blank on the ballot and no one declares for it ahead of time, according to this article, then there's going to be an appointment anyway. So I don't think we should take away the right to vote.
Question is on the amendment by Mr. Sprite. Are you ready for the question?
Mr.
Mr.
Moderator?
Yerfer?
Kathy Erford, District 1. I'm going to speak both to the amendment and to the question. I support what Mr. Sprite added, because I think if the amendment does pass, there should be the availability to make as wide an audience as possible. And I just wanted to support what Doris said, and also echo what Jesse said at the beginning of the meeting in terms of keeping it simple. A lot of what's been coming up today, I've been thinking a lot about the appropriateness of communication and the venue in which something is communicated. And while I completely appreciate the difficulty that Annette's office would have with this, I think it would be much more appropriate for this to be a public education campaign, or treated as a courtesy to her office, and let that communication to the populace occur in a different venue, as opposed to adding this into a legal document, which is the charter for our town. I don't believe this is the appropriate place for it.
Question is, shall you amend the article as recommended by Mr. Sprite? Are you ready for that question, Mr. DeGray?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good points all around here. And, you know, Andy made a good point where if someone was out of town and received 75 or 100 votes, they couldn't sit in the position. The other issue, which we didn't talk about here, is that for declaring, you have to fill out a form. And I'm not so sure that if it's communication, if this is the way that we're going to do, if verbal communication, if someone is out of town and says, hey, I have heard, as long as we have communication with the town clerk and I don't have access to the polls that day, I might have voted absentee ballot, or I might be out of town, and people want to write my name. And I'm sure you get tired of counting Daffy Duck's name and all the other crazy names that we see. And a lot of you here have been picked to serve in offices that you haven't run for. So although I am in support of, I do think Frick's amendment to move it up to 7 o'clock, that you have an opportunity to declare. If this passes, I would like to amend that to have verbal communication as well as or written.
I would consider that a friendly amendment.
Question is, on the Sprick amendment at this point, I think we ought to just take them one at a time, which is that you can declare prior to the closing of the polls. Is there any further discussion on the Frick amendment? If not, all in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. I think this is good. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The ayes have it, and you've amended the article. Mr. DeGray?
Well, Mr. Sprite said that he would accept that as a friendly amendment, and I'm not sure if you need me to put language in there to have at least written or verbal communication with the town clerk's office at the close of polling times. prior to closing of the polls. That is an amendment.
Okay. As I understand the amendment now, it would require write-in candidates to declare their candidacy by verbal or written communication prior to the close of the polls. Is that correct? Yes. All right. Is there a second to Mr. DeGray's amendment?
Second.
Okay. Mr. Franks.
Mr. Frank, Tom Franks, District 3. Who's that? I'd like to propose a friendly amendment to Mr. DeGray's amendment.
Well, we got an amendment. Oh.
A friendly amendment to Mr. DeGray's
Okay.
amendment. Rather than adding language, if we simply subtract language, the words "in writing" from the article as presented, it just says "must notify the town clerk." So I propose, offer that as a friendly amendment. Do you accept?
I would accept that.
Okay. Do you understand that? Friendly amendment that has been agreed to by Mr. DeGray and made by Mr. Franks is that would now read that the town require candidates to declare their candidacy prior to the close of the polls. Is that the way everybody understands it? Okay. Town requires, or should we say town clerk requires? Okay.
The town requires the notification to the town clerk.
Town requires candidates to declare their candidacy to the town clerk prior to the close of the polls. Are you ready for that question? Is that correct, Mr. Franks? Okay. Why doesn't somebody write it from me? Because I'm getting confused.
Candidate who intends to be a write-in candidate for town office must notify the town clerk prior to the close of polls on election day. And this would be taken out.
All right, so the proposal now is a candidate who intends to be a write-in candidate for a town office or representative town meeting member must notify the town clerk prior to the close of the polls on election day. Period. Mr. Underhill.
Ben Underhill, District 2. So if I text Annette and say, select board candidate, yes, write in select board candidate, yes, that would qualify. Okay, I just want to make sure, how does she know that it's coming from my phone? I'm just thinking that the phone but it might be blocked. It might say unknown name when it comes in. I'm just thinking, or an email, you know? Idiot at Putnam Insurance, how do you know it's me? So I'm just throwing things around for people to think of.
Okay, Mr. Barber?
Mr. Moderator, it seems to me it would be a mistake if we tied this requirement to the candidacy for any particular office. It should apply to all town elected offices. And from the way I heard you state it, it sounded to me as though you were saying it was only for town meeting members, but I may have misheard.
Let me read it again. A candidate who intends to be a write-in candidate for a town office or representative town meeting member must notify the town clerk prior to the close of the polls on election day.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, are you ready for that question? All those in favor of amending the article signify by standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. You have adopted the proposal of amendment, and the recurring question is, shall you adopt Article 11 as amended? All those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise. The ayes have it, and you've adopted Article 11. Pardon me? A division has been requested. Checkers, can you do the count, please? All in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of passage of Article 11, 55. Those opposed, 33. The article passes.
Mr. Moderator, point of order. This end of the table is hungry. All right, do you have any... What's your plan?
Unless there is objection, having had a motion made from a higher authority, I would like to say we'd recess until 1:30 promptly. Thank you.